Lucia placed her phone on the coffee table, the dry sound breaking the silence of the apartment. The lamp's light flickered slightly, a long-standing defect she had never bothered to fix. Outside, the wind howled, making the windows creak and echo through the room. It was an ordinary night, or so it seemed. After a long day at work, all Lucia wanted was to rest. She sank into the couch, her body sinking into the worn fabric, as she stared at the turned-off TV. The silence felt heavy, but she had grown used to it. Since moving into that small apartment, solitude had become her constant companion. The shrill ring of the phone abruptly shattered her peace. She flinched, her eyes darting to the device on the table, its screen glowing with an unknown number. It was late, too late for random calls. For a moment, she hesitated. Her finger hovered over the screen, her thumb sweaty against the glass. Something inside her warned her not to answer. But, as if driven by an automatic impulse, she swiped to accept. "Hello?" Her voice sounded steady, though her heart raced. On the other end, silence. An oppressive silence, interrupted only by something distant. It sounded like wind rushing through an empty space, followed by a faint whisper, barely perceptible. "Who is this?" she pressed, trying to control her tone. Then the voice came. Low, raspy, but unmistakable. "You thought no one would know, but everything will be revealed." Lucia felt the chill run through her body. She recognized that voice. Even after all these years, she knew exactly to whom it belonged. Pedro, a co-worker who had died in an accident. "What kind of sick joke is this?" she shouted, her voice trembling. No answer. Only the long tone of a disconnected call. She stared at the phone, the number still logged in the call history. Her fingers gripped the device tightly, as if she could crush the growing sense of dread within her. She tried to convince herself it was just a coincidence, a tasteless prank. But even as she placed the phone back on the table, she knew something was wrong. At that moment, Lucia realized that the solitude she had so readily embraced now felt filled with something, or someone. In the days that followed, Lucia tried to convince herself that the call had been nothing more than a prank. After all, who in their right mind would believe that a voice on the other end of the line belonged to a dead man? She repeated this to herself so many times that it almost sounded convincing. But what seemed like mere coincidence soon became an unsettling routine. The first call after that night came while she was making breakfast. The phone rang suddenly, its sound cutting through the gentle hiss of the kettle on the stove. Lucia glanced at the screen and saw another unknown number. A pang of anxiety surged in her chest, but reluctantly, she answered. "Hello?" The same silence stretched on, until the voice spoke. This time it was a woman. "You shouldn't have lied to me, Lucia." The mug she held slipped from her hand and shattered on the floor. That voice, it was Marissa, her childhood friend, who had died over 20 years ago in a car accident. "Who's doing this?" she shouted, her eyes fixed on the kitchen wall as if expecting something to emerge from it. But as before, the call ended abruptly. The third call came at night. This time, she didn't answer. The phone rang and rang until it stopped on its own. Lucia sat on the couch, hugging herself, her eyes glued to the device as if it might explode. When she finally convinced herself the silence had returned, the phone's ringtone blared again. It was off. The phone was off. Lucia stumbled back, nearly losing her balance. With trembling hands, she picked up the phone and checked the screen. There were no call records. The log was empty, as though no one had called. From that moment on, the calls came from different voices, but all belonged to people who had died and crossed her path in life. An ex-boyfriend who had taken his own life after a fight with her. An elderly neighbor she used to ignore in the building's hallways, who had passed away unnoticed. Each voice said something specific, intimate about their interactions with Lucia. They were accusations, truths spoken in an almost solemn tone. You knew what you were doing when you lied to him. Why didn't you help? Everything you've hidden, Lucia, will now come to light. She tried changing her number, but it made no difference. She tried replacing her phone, but the calls kept coming, as if they didn't rely on any technology at all. Lucia began to feel watched, as though something unseen hovered over her at all times. The worst part was the sound that accompanied the calls, a low hum, mingled with whispers she could barely understand. It was as if, even when the phone wasn't ringing, she could still hear them somewhere in the distance. As the days passed, her dread of answering the phone blended with the growing certainty that the voices knew everything. Everything she had tried so hard to forget. By the third week, Lucia no longer knew what rest felt like. Her nights were sleepless and endless, her days blurred into a haze of anxiety and paranoia. The calls came at unpredictable hours, and she had come to fear the phone's ring as if it heralded her own demise. She needed answers. It was impossible that all of this was just in her mind. The voices knew things she didn't dare admit even to herself. At that point, rationality no longer offered any solace. Her first attempt was to turn to technology. Lucia visited a repair shop and explained her problem as if it were a common glitch. She said she was receiving calls without records and wanted to trace where they were coming from. The technician, a distracted young man, hooked the device up to the system. After a few minutes, he looked up confused. There's no record of any calls in the past few weeks. Everything is clean. She tried to argue, but his expression was clear. Either she was lying or she was losing her mind. Lucia left the shop with trembling hands, the phone buried deep in her bag as if it were a ticking time bomb. Next, she turned to Sophia, an old acquaintance who worked as a medium, helping people desperate to connect with the beyond. Lucia had never believed in the supernatural, but at this point, there was no room for skepticism. The calls won't stop, she explained, sitting at the worn wooden table in Sophia's small apartment. They tell me things only I know. Sophia listened silently, her eyes studying Lucia with a calm that was both unnerving and comforting. When the session began, the medium lit candles and clasped Lucia's hands firmly. The air in the room grew heavy, as if it had taken on weight. Sophia closed her eyes and murmured incomprehensible words. For a moment, the silence was absolute, until she gasped and gripped Lucia's hands tightly. These voices, they aren't just trying to speak to you. They want something. What? What do they want? Lucia asked urgently. Justice. Or vengeance. The word struck Lucia like a blow. Sophia didn't know the secrets Lucia had been hiding, but her response felt disturbingly accurate. Suddenly, the faces began to resurface in Lucia's mind. Pedro's vacant stare, Marissa's lost smile, the anger in her ex-boyfriend's eyes. They all shared one thing in common. Something had happened to them because of her. Sophia stared at her intently. Lucia, these voices, they won't stop. The cycle is closing, and you're part of it. Lucia tried to protest, but deep down, she knew the medium was right. The calls weren't coincidences. They were tied to something much deeper, something she had tried so hard to keep buried. The early hours of the morning dragged on, and Lucia curled up on the sofa, her phone powered off, and the apartment submerged in darkness. Yet the whispers persisted. They no longer came from the phone, but seemed to float in the air, reverberating in her mind. It was as though the voices no longer needed a physical medium to reach her. Sophia's words echoed in her head. The cycle is closing. Lucia knew there was no escaping it. The voices knew too much, and now they were closer than ever. When the phone rang again, the sound sliced through the silence like a blade. She hesitated, but something deep inside compelled her to answer. "Hello?" Her voice was barely more than a whisper, frail and fading. This time, the voice on the other end was her own. "You knew this day would come, Lucia," the voice said, cold and devoid of emotion. "Who are you?" Lucia asked, her hands trembling as she clutched the device. "I'm you from where you'll soon be." Her blood ran cold. The overwhelming sensation of being dragged towards something inevitable consumed her. It was as if every secret she had hidden, every selfish decision she had made, was now turning against her. The voice continued mercilessly. "You remember, don't you? You lied to Pedro, and he paid the price. You abandoned Marissa when she needed you most. And him, well, you know what you did to him." She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the memories, but it was futile. The images came flooding back, clear and unforgiving. The betrayals, the choices that had condemned others so she could move forward. "Time's up, Lucia," the voice said. "Now, it's your turn to speak from the other side." The phone slipped from her hand. Lucia glanced around, and for the first time, she saw shadows moving along the walls, indistinct shapes that seemed to be watching her. The voices were no longer confined to the phone. They were here with her, filling the room with a relentless hum. At last, Lucia understood. There was no longer a barrier between the world of the living and the dead. Not for her. The phone rang one final time. The sound was muffled, as though coming from a deep, distant place. Lucia knew she couldn't ignore it. Trembling, she picked up the device, and before she could speak, her own voice filled the silence. "It's time, Lucia." Without thinking, she pressed the button to answer. But instead of hearing a voice, the world around her began to warp. The shadows that once danced along the walls now closed in, engulfing her. The air thickened, becoming almost impossible to breathe. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her vision dimmed as the whispers grew deafening. Hundreds of voices speaking at once, echoing inside her mind, exposing every truth she had spent her life burying. And then silence. Lucia opened her eyes. She was in a cold, empty place, with no walls and no light. In front of her stood an old telephone resting on a small table. It began to ring. With trembling hands, she picked up the receiver. "Hello?" Her voice answered from the other side, clear and cold. A hesitant voice replied, unsure and afraid. The cycle had begun anew.